Welcome to Alaska EdVenture, Lessons from the K-12 Frontier, with your host, Dr. Meinert, Superintendent of the Fairbanks North Star Borough School District. This podcast is your gateway to the heart of Alaska's educational landscape, where each episode features guests sharing their unique perspectives. We are bringing together voices that shape education in the last frontier. Join us as we explore the challenges, triumphs, and innovations in Alaska's K-12 classrooms.
Welcome back to the Alaska EdVenture podcast. I'm Dr. Luke Meinert, the host of this podcast, and I am the superintendent of the Fairbanks North Star Borough School District. Super excited to be back with all of you, and very pleased to have Mr. Andy Degraw on the podcast with me today.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Andy, you fill a potentially important role, or a particularly important role in the school district. So what do you do for us?
Yeah, so my title is Chief Operations Officer, and that has to do with everything non-instructional. So my main responsibility is managing the finances of the district, but then other areas of operations, technology, human resources, transportation, food services, purchasing, accounting, kind of the list goes on and on.
Man, sometimes. That is a deep list there.
Yeah, I could think of others, but we'll keep it at that. So,
all right.
Yeah, just kind of anything non-instructional is kind of what I oversee. So.
Perfect. And Andy, you grew up in Fairbanks.
Yeah.
If you could talk a little bit about your background, just to give the listeners a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I grew up in Fairbanks. My family moved here when I was 3 and went through the whole K-12 system. Started at Joy Elementary, and then went on to Barnett, Weller, and then went to Tanana and graduated from Lathrop. So grew up here and left the state once I went to college, and then had the unique opportunity to come back. So I've been back for about just coming up on 6 years back in Fairbanks. So family loves it. So it's good to be back.
Awesome. Well, it's definitely great to have Andy as a part of our crew, and it's fun to have somebody that was born and raised here in Fairbanks, and definitely some rivalries that come up depending on if it's a Lathrop West Valley game.
Go Malamutes.
There we go.
Yeah.
He's in good company. So it's great to have a Lathrop grad here at the ADC doing so much important work for the school district. And today I really wanted to bring you on. We're starting our budget season here in the Fairbanks North Star Borough School District, as well as school districts around the state. And so of that very long list that you talked about of the important tasks that you have for the school district, wanted to talk budget with you a little bit.
Yeah. So obviously budget has been in the spotlight the last few years, and this year is going to be no different. It's a big topic here locally. Obviously the work we do is important. And so, just making sure we maximize the funding we can get locally as well as at the state level. There will be a lot going on in Juneau over the next few months, and just there'll be a big spotlight on a lot of things going on here in the next few months. So.
Yeah, and for the listeners, could you talk a little bit about how school districts are funded? You mentioned the state. You mentioned the local municipality, which is our borough. But talk a little bit about how school districts are funded in the state of Alaska.
Yeah, so there's 3 main funding buckets. We're funded at the state level. That's the majority of our funding. And then at the local level, the Borough Assembly each year approves a local contribution that they contribute to the district. And then we also receive some federal funds called Impact Aid. That's the majority of it. And that's given because we have students that are military connected here at Eielson Air Force Base and then Fort Wainwright. So those 3 are the 3 main funding revenue sources that we have. And it's important for people to understand, in other states, a lot of school districts are able to raise additional funds, if they need, capital projects or just operations funding. Here in Alaska, we don't have the ability to raise our own funds. So we're fully dependent on those 3 revenue sources, and that's kind of what we get from those sources is what we have to spend.
Yeah, okay. And can you walk us through a little bit of the budget timeline? So as I mentioned in our intro, we're just kicking off the budget cycle, so to speak, for our school district. But what does that look like here in the months to come?
Yeah, so the general calendar is, as you and I have been working a lot with departments over the last couple of months to put together the first draft of the budget. It's called the proposed budget, and that proposed budget will go public on February 1st. And then we'll present that budget to the Board of Education on February 5th at a work session, and then at the regular board meeting on February 6th. And then the Board of Education will, quote unquote, work that budget for about close to 2 months, 5 or 6 weeks. They'll get feedback from the public, stakeholder input, testimony, written testimony, verbal, and so they will have several work sessions where they'll look at that proposed budget, and they will come up with what's called the recommended budget, the second draft of our budget. And that budget, they'll establish an ask of the borough for the local contribution as part of that recommended budget. That will go to the borough on April 1st. And then the borough receives that, and they work that ask, the local contribution ask, into their borough budget. And they'll do that, they'll take about a month and a half to deliberate and go through that process. And they typically establish a local contribution that they'll give to us right around the second week of May. And then after that, if we receive what we ask for from the borough, oftentimes there's maybe not a lot of changes from that recommended budget, the second version, to the final third version, the approved budget. But this year, the last few years have been a little unique because the state has taken kind of an inordinate amount of time to wrap up their work. And so, we're hopeful that we'll see additional revenue from the state possibly, and it could come after that May time period. And so, but then, the board will continue to work through the month of May, and then hopefully not too much of the month of June, and they'll be able to come up with a final approved budget, which is the third version of our budget.
Yeah, absolutely. So, definitely a challenging process putting that all together, especially as you noted, the state's funding formula and the funding timeline for the state being not necessarily in line with our budgetary process. It would be, I've always said it would be nice to forward fund education and know last year what the legislature did, we would know exactly going into this budget cycle what our revenues would be from the state to have a little bit more predictability, but bring some challenges to us, and then the unpredictability at the borough level this year too.
I always say, there's a problem with the numbers. We haven't had a funding increase in 7 consecutive years. So you'll hear the term BSA. That's the main dollar amount that's multiplied by our enrollment to determine our state funding. We need an increase in the BSA. That's a problem. But also a problem is the calendar, like you mentioned. And we have to make staffing decisions, in late winter, early spring. And when we don't know our revenue, have revenue certainty, we have to, it's hard to make decisions. So that's what we're looking at with the BSA on the state side of the revenue equation. And then looking at the local side, we very much appreciate the working relationship we've had with the borough, with Mayor Ward. He's been great to work with, and the assembly has always been very supportive of education. What we're looking at with the size of the deficit that we're looking at, we're likely going to see an increase in the ask of the borough at the proposed and recommended budget levels. And so the challenge that we're likely going to see there is we have a tax cap here in the borough. And so there could be some challenges and getting to the level of the ask that we're likely going to see. So, again, an opportunity to advocate and just, for the two organizations to come together and figure out. I think this is important. I think we all want a strong, solid K-12 public education system here in Fairbanks, and we have a history of supporting that. And so I think, where there's a will, there's a way. And so I'm optimistic and hopeful, and look forward to the work that we'll need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the listeners that might not know the details that can you talk a little bit about the minimum contribution and the maximum contribution and how that works at the borough level and where we're at within that framework?
Yeah, so there's a required local contribution, and that's right around $38 million is the required minimum, 38.5-ish. And then the maximum is just above 70 million, right between 70 and 71 million. And so last year, the borough allocated $54 million to the district. And so we're kind of in the middle range of the minimum and the maximum. And so, yeah, what we're seeing is the ask of the borough this year. Last year, the the Board of Education requested $59 million in its recommended budget. And so we're likely to see possibly an ask somewhere in that neighborhood again. And so again, going back to the tax cap that exists here in the borough, that'll be the challenge, is how do we get to that dollar amount?
Sure. Yeah. Well, especially, with the unprecedented deficits that we're facing in this school year, it's no secret. We've been out there. Our estimated deficit for the FY25 budget is around $28 million, which is a sizable amount in our overall budget.
Yeah, 28 to $29 million. It's
always bringing the bad news.
Yeah, I know.
Andy,
sorry, I always have to
go down. I
always have to tell people it's a fluid number, and unfortunately, it's not fluid usually in the downward direction. Yeah. But so that's roughly 15% of our general fund budget. So it's a huge amount, and so that's where we're really hopeful in our advocacy efforts in Juneau, as well as, again, as I mentioned, working with the borough to see what we can do to increase things on the revenue side, and we'll certainly have a lot of work to do on the expenditure side to balance the budget.
Yeah, absolutely. And you might have touched on that just briefly, but I'd like you to go a little bit more in depth in terms of the history of BSA funding and how did we get to where we are today with a $28 million deficit? There's a ton of things that go into that. There's inflation, there was CARES funding. So can you talk a little bit about the details of that?
Yeah. So the last BSA increase was 7 years. This might be the 8th year, 8 years consecutive this year if we don't receive a permanent increase. And so the main expenditure, about 87% of the district's budget is personnel related. So salaries and benefits for our staff that are doing great things with kids, working in the trenches, teaching, supporting, doing all kinds of great things on a daily basis. So given that that's the lion's share of our expenditure, every year we have cost increases. And so absent increases on the revenue side, each year it becomes harder and harder to balance that budget. And so in the last 7 to 8 years, we've used cash reserves to balance our budget. So you'll hear the term fund balance, in different meetings when we're meeting with the board. You'll hear the term fund balance. That means cash reserves, so a rainy day fund that we have sitting on the sideline. We also benefited, as you mentioned, a lot from CARES funds. So that was pandemic relief funds from the federal government. We close to fully exhausted our cash reserves 2-3 years ago. And it was very fortunate that we received CARES funds about that time to be able to replace our fund balance utilization with those CARES funds to balance our budget. The downside is that we're going to exhaust the last remaining CARES funds in this current FY24 school year. And so for FY25, we won't have those funds available again. So again, that just kind of heightens the challenges that are facing us.
Yeah.
So
it's tough to get your arms around what a $28 million deficit looks like. We know it's a big number. $28 million is certainly a lot of money, but what does that look like in a school district as we're starting to try to balance that budget?
Yeah. So, just to give folks some context, if we, and we did this a couple of years ago, it's a tough process, but just to give people an idea, the district when we close a school, we save around $1.5 million, depending on whether it's an elementary school or a middle school or a high school, somewhere between $1 million and $2 million. So, that compared to the 28 million, it's
another drop in the bucket.
It's a drop in the bucket. Yep. Another example for context is, if we were to raise the class size by 5 students in every classroom in the school district, that would save about $7.5–8 million. And so, there's $28 million is a big deficit, and it's going to take a lot of big items to be able to balance that budget, unfortunately, and none of the choices are going to be popular. None of the things that we'll be looking at are going to be, positive things.
The size of that deficit, you look at it and you're like hoping that one thing, one hard decision chips away at the majority of that deficit. And that really just isn't going to happen this year. As I've worked with you and building the budget over the last couple of months, it really is going to add up to a lot of difficult choices, a lot of unpopular choices, and choices that I never thought as an educational leader we would be forced into even considering. And so it's heartbreaking to go into that process knowing that cuts do affect real lives, the real education of our children. I mean, the mission of our school district, providing an excellent education for students every day, and seeing the lack of revenue come in and the lack of funding to continue to provide at times a really high level of education for students, and it cuts into those opportunities and options that we're able to provide our students. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot is, and the board does too, when they're going through this budgetary process, is trying to make the least amount of impacts on the classroom and the students as possible. And
absolutely, yeah. Yeah. Can I provide
Absolutely,
one more point of context? And it comes up a lot. And speaking of, cuts as far away from the classroom as possible, every year administration comes up looking at, what levels of administration are we carrying and are we being efficient in that arena? Right now, if you look at our non-represented employee group, it's roughly around $10 to $11 million, which is about 5% of our general fund expenditures. And so for context there, if we were to cut administration, which we have been doing over the last 5-6 years, ever since I've been here, we little by little cutting administration. If we were to make a 10% cut to that administration group, that would save us $1 million. And it really would be a debilitating reduction in our administration services. And it's always important to remember the support that group provides directly to schools. And I know that, stories could go on for days on the support that group provides in human resources and technology and even accounting services, sitting with admin secretaries, but, we could go on and on, technology, kind of needless to say, not hard to understand the support that's needed there in schools for students to have devices and staff to have functioning devices as well. So, but I just like to point that out to just give context to the public that if we made a 10% debilitating cut, that would get us $1 million. So again, compared to the $28 million that we need, it's tough. But yes, we're constantly, when we start looking at reductions to be made, we begin as far away from the classroom as we can.
Yeah. And I did want to circle back around to that school closure conversation. That's one, that's a difficult emotional process. The school district went through this process a couple of years ago and closed multiple schools here in Fairbanks. And so, earlier in the podcast, we said it's a drop in the bucket, but it is a real drop in the bucket in terms of savings, not only this year and into the future. And so what are some of the reasons why the school district should maybe consider school closure in the future?
Yeah, so that's a great point to make, is that the savings from school closures are perpetual. They're every year going forward. One of the main things that we look at is are we maintaining physical square footage beyond the needs for our current enrollment? So, you look back historically, if you look back 10, 15 years, we had 1,000 to 1,500 more students than we do today. And so comparing those historical enrollments to what we have today and then determining, at what percentage are our buildings full or to capacity. So if we have multiple schools that are at 50% capacity or 60% capacity, are we being efficient and being wise overseers of taxpayer dollars? Really, that's what it boils down to, is are we using those dollars to the best of our ability? And then, so, if we can, we want to spend our money directly on instruction the most we can. And so we want to reduce the amount of dollars we're spending on maintaining excess square footage. The other thing to look at is, recently, the last few years, it's been difficult to fully staff our school district. And I think that's a challenge that all organizations have faced, the last few years, especially post-COVID. So if we're running vacancies, a significant number of vacancies in school buildings, that's reducing the services that students are able to access, if counselors or nurses or food service employees.
Special education.
Special ed's a huge one. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. If we're able to reduce the number of positions we need to educate the same number of kids, we're actually able to increase the services available to students and improve their educational experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as I said, it's hard to propose any kind of cuts, but some of these cuts that don't have a direct impact on the classroom in terms of adding additional students to every class or cutting specific programs are things that I think responsibly we probably need to take a look at.
And this is an important thing to note, because and we have, the nice thing is we have experience. We've done this before now, so we have experience to look back at. When we closed the 3 schools a couple of years ago, because of just resignations and retirements and people exiting the district, very few, if any, I don't want to be quoted on this, but it might have been 1 or 2 staff members in the entire school district that lost their position. And they were able to get a different position within the school district. So it's important to note that just if we go down the path of looking at closing schools, that doesn't necessarily mean that huge swaths of employees are going to lose their jobs.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I do want to talk about a couple other things that are challenges for us that have specific pots of money available for them, or that we would like more money available for them, and transportation being one of those. So can you explain some of the challenges we've had for in transportation, and then specifically on the funding side of it?
Yeah, so certainly there's been challenges attracting drivers, alluding to that labor market challenge. We've seen some positive movement in being able to, in our contractor Durham, being able to attract more drivers and add to that driver pool. So hopefully, the positive is we're being able to add some service here in the Fairbanks area. The financial challenge that we're looking at is similar to the BSA. We haven't received increase in transportation funding for 8 consecutive years. And so again, the same as regular general fund costs, those transportation costs are increasing each year, and it's more and more difficult each year to pay for those transportation services. So right now, what we're doing in order to bridge the gap between the amount of revenue we receive, just for context, full service transportation would be about $3.5 million more than the funding we get from the state. So there's a $3.5 million gap. Now, we're not running full service, but even with reduced service, we're still about between $1 million and $1.5 million, $2 million, $1 million and $2 million short. And so right now we're plugging that hole with our fund balance, which are with our transportation cash reserves that are sitting on the sideline. Unfortunately, those are possibly going to be exhausted by the end of this year. And so we'll be looking at a deficit there in transportation as well. And I know there is some momentum in Juneau to increase transportation funding. So we're hopeful for that.
Yeah, definitely hopeful for that. And, there'll definitely be a call for advocacy at the end of this podcast to talk about what's next and what all of you that are listening to this podcast can do if you want to help support our schools. The last piece I want to talk about is the READS Act. We've talked about the READS Act a couple times here on the podcast. If you've been following the school district, it's been a big topic of conversation this year. It's a new law within the state of Alaska that school districts are implementing to promote K through 3 literacy and improve our literacy proficiencies at those grade levels. But wanted to talk about the budget side of things with that. Have we seen any money come our way to help support that effort? Yeah,
very little, really. And I think, obviously who doesn't want our young ones to learn better? Obviously, the problem is being able to have resources to be able to implement the different components of the READS Act. So we received a $30 increase to the BSA when the READS Act was passed. $30 equals between $600,000 and $700,000 for the school district, and so that's really, when we're talking drops in a bucket, that really is a drop in the bucket on the amount of resources we need to fully implement that act.
Yeah, absolutely. And the READS Act does have a lot of required things for the school district, such as outside of the school day instruction, which also includes the summer. We've estimated, a very conservative estimate, is probably over $1.5 million to provide adequate services for that. I've told this story on the podcast before, but I have to keep going back to it. DEED and their overview, looking at our READS Act plan that we submitted to the state. One of the pieces of critical feedback they gave to us was, hey, your intervention group sizes, and when I say intervention, it's that extra help for students that are struggling in reading. Those group sizes are too large. You should make those smaller. Well, you know what? The one thing how you can make those smaller is additional staff.
Additional staff.
Yeah,
right,
and
right.
so that's something that we're having challenges with. We don't have the revenues, the additional monies, just to have additional staff to help implement the READS Act appropriately. And so
we don't have enough staff at this point to maintain our current class sizes. Let alone create smaller groups that the READS Act would require.
Yep, absolutely.
I always go back to, because a lot of talk goes on when increase to education funding is talked about in Juneau. There's talk about we want to see a return on our investment, and so the READS Act is I think a great initiative to help kids read better. But unfortunately, that's going to require additional responsibilities on the school district, and so any kind of investment requires an investment to get a return on that investment.
Absolutely.
And so there's very few scenarios in the world where you can get a return without making an investment.
Yep.
And certainly, an investment in the READS Act and what we're trying to do there would be very appropriate.
It would definitely be very helpful. A silver lining in all of this, I do want to give a shout out to our educators that are in the classroom, those working with our K-3 students. We did get our winter benchmark assessment scores back, and they did improve from fall to winter, which was super exciting, and they improved in all 4 grade bands. So kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade. Collectively, all of those groups showed improvement from fall to winter in M-class, despite the lack of resources that are being given to the school district.
So what could we see if we actually did see an infusion of an investment and being able to add, additional educators to help those students?
Absolutely. I mean, it's proven research-based that if you do have smaller group sizes, that those interventions can be held and can be conducted very well with smaller group sizes, and that you see a return on that investment. And so we're hopeful. There is a bill within the Alaska legislature this year, I believe, to give $1,000 for every student that's not showing proficiency in K-3. And so I'm definitely a big proponent of anything of that legislation or legislation that adequately provides funding for the READS Act.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, sometimes, a lot of the requests, and I'm not faulting this, but a lot of the requests are just increase our funding, kind of just carte blanche. If that's, I don't disagree with that position. I think we want to embrace, if there's talk of specific increases in funding targeted at certain areas like the READS Act, we should embrace those opportunities because it's such a noble cause.
Yeah, definitely. And, when I think about this funding, like, I'm the superintendent of the school district, but I'm also a dad. I've got young kids in the school district. And so as we're talking about these deficits, these potential big cuts, it hits home to me too, right? Like, this is my children's education. You're a dad. It's your children's education. Yeah. And so we have a lot at stake here. And so I would say if you want to support the efforts of the school district, please be an advocate. Go talk to your legislators. Go talk to your assembly members and tell those stories about how increased funding would make a difference to you and your family and the students that attend Fairbanks schools.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any additional kind of final thoughts on budget timelines from you?
Yeah, no, just that, as I mentioned before, we'll be presenting the first version of our budget in a couple of weeks, and as you mentioned, it's going to be challenging. It's going to be a tough situation that we're in. But I would just like to repeat what you said earlier about the appreciation of the people in our district. There's a ton of good people. When I have the opportunity to get out into schools and see what's going on in the trenches, it never ceases to amaze me, the good work that's being done. And so, despite, sometimes I'm seen as the messenger of bad news, but I can appreciate that and understand that. But I want everyone to know that I know what goes on out in the trenches in schools and in classrooms, and appreciate it a ton. Yeah, I'm a dad too. Still have 3 kids in the system. So very appreciative.
Well, I'm definitely appreciative of Andy's work. As he said, he often is the bearer of bad news. And so a lot of times people come after Andy and they're like, why are you making these decisions? And so I greatly appreciate Andy. We've had the opportunity to work together for multiple years now. And then the last 6 months with me being in the superintendent position, I appreciate his position and his conservative nature to budgeting. I think that's super important. You're keeping us out of issues that maybe some other school districts are facing around the state with your conservative projections and making sure that we have fund balance and a rainy day fund.
Yeah, just real quickly on that note, folks might have, seen some headlines on a district, a little farther south than us and the financial challenges that they're facing. I've said for many years that the quickest thing that'll take a whole district's focus off of educating kids is financial problems and going off the path on their finances, and then how much in resources and focus and attention needs to be focused, money. That shouldn't be the main primary focus of a school district. Yeah. And so, that's always been my intent, is to keep us kind of on the straight and narrow in our finances and in a good position so that we can keep that focus on, improving reading scores and other important things. So.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for the work that you do. And thanks to the listeners for tuning back into the Alaska EdVenture podcast with Dr. Luke Meinert. It's been a great conversation discussing the budget. Those listeners that are here in Fairbanks, I do invite you into the budgetary process as that proposed budget comes out and the board's working through the recommended budget. Please come to our school board members, talk to me, talk to board members in terms of what your priorities are for that budget. And then we do ask you to connect with your legislators. Go to www.akledge.gov. And you can connect with your legislators there, and then also connect with your assembly members and the mayor to tell them how important education funding is in the borough. And so just thank you very much for tuning in, and thanks for supporting Fairbanks Schools. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you for embarking on this Alaska EdVenture with us. Hit that subscribe button, and we'll meet you on the next episode.